Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hello, Herman and Corn. So, we're on the third day of the war between Israel and Iran, with the US joining in a joint operation. And we've heard there's been extensive operations throughout the night and throughout the day by Israel in Iran, and the Iranians, for their part, have kept up their attacks. We just had one siren here in Jerusalem, and I think from 2 or 3 during the night at least. So we're now in a sheltered space, a mamad, with a bed, which feels incredibly luxurious compared to sleeping in the car park and dashing back and forth to it. So it's a bit of a reprieve, even if we're still woken up. And last night we had a horrible attack in Jerusalem, which we heard what the distinctive noise of what sounded like a cluster warhead, which is, I think, confirmed to have been used. And then not just this, but in multiple attacks. So we're hearing lots and lots of explosions every time that they occur. I was reading the news this morning and I saw that last night Israel, the IAF, also struck targets in Beirut and Lebanon in order to send a clear message to Hezbollah that it shouldn't get involved beyond what it has already done in the conflict. I mentioned to a friend who serves in the reservists, as so many people do, that I always find it extraordinary how much, with the limited manpower that Israel has, I mean, it's not totally limited. It's a relatively large army, even by just looking at the standing army, but there's still only so many people. And we look at the different fronts Israel has to operate on. For example, the last, since the start of this war, there's been also sending units into the West Bank in order to prevent a potential uprising on the part of Iran on that front. So if you look at the fronts that Israel is active on at any one time, we have Hezbollah, we have Syria, we have cyber, we have space regarding intelligence gathering. And just from a mission standpoint at the moment, obviously a huge amount of resources deployed towards Iran, but also running sorties over Lebanon last night. So my question for you, Herman and Corn, is any armed forces, including the US, has a finite supply of the most valuable assets, its fighter pilots, its jets, and even if there's a huge upsurge in what's happening in an operation like in Iran at the moment, you can't put all of your eggs there, because then you're going to leave a gaping gap in another part of your defense on another front, which will be very quickly exploited. So it sounds like the ultimate game of resource management to me, whereby a military has to figure out where it needs to put assets without ever putting too many assets into any one location. And I'd love to get a sense for Israel seems to be an almost extreme example in which it's a small country surrounded by we didn't even talk about Jordan, Egypt, so many different fronts, and it has to figure out a way to maintain security across all of those. How does that work in practice, Herman and Corn? Over to you two.
Welcome back to My Weird Prompts, everyone. I am Corn, and I have to say, that audio we just heard from our housemate Daniel really brings home the reality of where we are right now. We are sitting here in Jerusalem, and as Daniel mentioned, it is day 3 of this massive escalation between Israel and Iran. You could hear the sirens in his recording, and that distinctive sound of interceptions. It is a heavy time, but it is also a time where the questions Daniel is asking are more relevant than ever.
Herman Poppleberry here, and Corn, listening to Daniel describe being in the Mamad, our safe room, while hearing those explosions, it is intense. It is one thing to read about military strategy in a textbook or a research paper, but it is another thing entirely when the resource management he is asking about is happening right over our heads in real time. Daniel is touching on something fundamental to modern warfare. How does a nation, especially one the size of Israel, handle a multi-front war without stretching itself to the breaking point?
Exactly. He mentioned Iran, Lebanon, the West Bank, and even the role of the United States in these joint operations. It feels like a giant game of three-dimensional chess where the pieces are finite, but the board is expanding every hour. So, Herman, let us dig into this. When we talk about resource management in a conflict like this, where do we even begin?
We have to start with the concept of the economy of force. It is one of the 9 principles of war that military students have been studying for over a century. The idea is simple in theory but incredibly difficult in practice. You cannot be strong everywhere at once. If you try to defend every inch of your border with equal intensity, you end up being weak everywhere. So resource management is really the art of deciding where you can afford to be thin so that you can be overwhelming where it matters most.
Right. And in this specific context, the where it matters most seems to be changing by the minute. Last night it was targets in Beirut to send a message to Hezbollah, and today it is long-range strikes into Iran. Meanwhile, there are operations in the West Bank and maritime threats from the Houthis in the Red Sea. How do you prioritize those? Is there a hierarchy of threats?
There absolutely is. In the current Israeli doctrine, the hierarchy usually starts with existential threats, followed by strategic threats, and then tactical ones. Iran, with its long-range missile capabilities and nuclear ambitions, is the existential or strategic top tier. Hezbollah is a massive strategic threat because of their sheer volume of rockets. The West Bank is often viewed as a tactical and internal security challenge, while the Houthi threat in the Red Sea is a maritime bottleneck. The genius, or perhaps the necessity, of the Israel Defense Forces is how they use different types of assets for each. You do not use a $500 million F-35 stealth fighter to patrol a village in the West Bank if you can help it. You use ground forces, drones, and intelligence assets there, saving the high-end jets for the deep strikes into Iran.
That makes sense, but Daniel raised a great point about the pilots themselves. You can build more jets eventually, but you cannot just manufacture a combat-ready pilot in a week. These guys are flying around the clock. How does the human element factor into this resource management?
That is actually the most critical bottleneck. In the world of military aviation, we talk about the pilot-to-seat ratio. You want more pilots than you have cockpits so you can rotate them and keep the planes in the air 24/7. But during an all-out war like this one, those pilots are hitting their maximum flight hours very quickly. Fatigue is a massive risk. This is where the integration with the United States becomes a literal lifesaver. When Daniel mentions the US joining in a joint operation, he is not just talking about extra firepower, he is talking about capacity.
So, the US assets provide a sort of relief valve for the Israeli pilots.
Exactly. Think of it like a load balancing server. If the Israeli Air Force is at 95% capacity just handling the northern and southern fronts, and then a new threat emerges from, say, the east, the US Air Force can step in to handle the long-range refueling, the maritime patrol, or even specific strike packages. This allows the Israeli pilots to focus on the immediate threats to their own borders. It is a symbiotic relationship. The US brings the scale, and Israel brings the local intelligence and the immediate proximity.
I want to go back to something Daniel mentioned about the West Bank. He said they are sending units there to prevent an uprising. If you are shifting thousands of reservists to the West Bank, does that not leave the border with Lebanon or the border with Gaza more vulnerable? We have discussed this kind of thing before. Remember back in episode 680 when we talked about the 12-Day War and how algorithms were starting to play a role in these deployments.
Oh, I remember that one well. And you are hitting on a major shift that has happened since then. Here in 2026, we are seeing the culmination of what we call algorithmic warfare. The resource management Daniel is asking about is no longer just a bunch of generals standing around a paper map with wooden blocks. It is being handled by sophisticated AI systems like the Gospel or Fireweaver, which are part of the digital handshake we discussed in episode 871. These systems are constantly calculating the probability of an attack on any given front.
Wait, so an AI is telling them where to send the troops?
It is providing the data to make those decisions. It looks at intercepted communications, satellite imagery of troop movements in Syria, social media sentiment in the West Bank, and even weather patterns that might affect drone flights. If the system sees a 30% increase in chatter in a specific sector, it might suggest moving a battalion from a quiet area to that sector before anything even happens. It is predictive resource management.
That sounds incredibly efficient, but also a bit terrifying. What happens when the AI gets it wrong? Or what happens if the enemy knows you are relying on an algorithm and they feed it bad data?
That is the big risk, Corn. It is called algorithmic spoofing. If Hezbollah knows that the Israeli defense systems prioritize certain patterns of movement, they can simulate those patterns to draw resources away from the actual point of attack. It is a classic feint, but updated for the digital age. This is why you still need that human intuition. The commanders have to look at what the machine is saying and ask, does this feel like a trap?
It really is a game of resources. But the resources are not just bullets and fuel, they're attention and cognitive bandwidth. If I am a commander, I only have so much mental energy to devote to each front.
That is a brilliant point. Cognitive load is a finite resource. This is why the Israeli military structure is so decentralized. The commander on the northern front has a huge amount of autonomy. He is not waiting for the general staff in Tel Aviv to tell him every single move. This decentralization prevents the bottleneck at the top.
Let us talk about the specific assets for a second. Daniel mentioned fighter pilots and jets, but what about missile defense? We saw in the audio that Daniel was listening to the interceptions. Systems like the Iron Dome, David's Sling, the Arrow 3, those interceptors are incredibly expensive, and they take time to produce. In a war with Iran, where they are firing hundreds of missiles, how do you manage that inventory?
You are spot on. This is perhaps the most intense part of the resource management game right now. Each Arrow 3 interceptor costs millions of dollars. You do not want to use one to knock down a cheap drone or a rocket that is headed for an empty field. The system has to make a split-second decision. Where is this missile going to land? If the predicted impact point is an open park or the sea, the system will actually let it fall. It saves the interceptor for the missile headed for a hospital or a power plant.
And what about the new tech? I was reading that the iron beam laser system is supposed to bring that cost down to just a few dollars per shot.
Oh, that is the holy grail of resource management. We are seeing the first operational units of iron beam being deployed right now in early 2026. It is not a full replacement yet because lasers have trouble in cloudy weather, but on a clear day it basically gives you an infinite magazine. As long as you have electricity, you have interceptors. It solves the finite supply problem Daniel asked about.
It feels like the definition of a front is also changing. Daniel mentioned cyber and space. How do those factor into this finite supply of assets? I mean, you do not have a limited number of cyber attacks in the same way you have a limited number of missiles, do you?
Well, you actually do. A cyber weapon is often a one-time use asset. Once you use a specific exploit to shut down a power grid, the enemy sees it, they patch it, and that weapon is gone. You have spent years developing that capability, and it evaporates in seconds. So, deciding when to pull the trigger on a major cyber operation is a huge part of resource management. Do you use your best exploit now to disrupt an Iranian missile launch, or do you save it for a potential escalation later?
I want to pivot back to the civilian side of this. Daniel is in a safe room. Part of resource management is also managing the resilience of the population. If the war drags on, the economic cost of having hundreds of thousands of reservists away from their jobs is astronomical. How does a country manage the resource of its own economy during a war like this?
That is the ticking clock in the background. Israel's economy is heavily dependent on the tech sector. When you call up the reservists, you are calling up the software engineers and startup founders. If they are in uniform for 3 months, the economy takes a massive hit. This creates a strategic pressure to end the conflict quickly. They manage their military resources to be as aggressive and decisive as possible early on to avoid a long war of attrition.
It is like a high-stakes sprint versus a marathon. You want to finish it in a sprint because you know you do not have the lungs for a marathon.
That is a great analogy, and that is why we see these massive operations. They are trying to degrade the enemy's capabilities so quickly that the threat level drops to a point where they can send some of those reservists back home. It is a test of who has the deeper pockets and the more resilient supply chains. And in this case, the US logistical machine is the ultimate deep pocket. As long as the US is willing to keep the transport planes flying with fresh interceptors, Israel can stay in the fight.
Well, Herman, you have given us a lot to think about. From the economy of force to algorithmic warfare and the vital role of the US-Israel partnership. It is a sober reminder of the world we are living in right now. Thanks to Daniel for sending in that prompt. It is good to know you are safe in the mamad, buddy.
If you are finding these deep dives helpful, please take a moment to leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. We are an independent show, and those reviews really help new people find us.
For everyone else, you can find all our past episodes at our website, myweirdprompts.com. Stay safe out there, everyone, and keep asking those questions. We will be back next week with another exploration into the weird, the complex, and the fascinating.
Until next time.
Take care.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.